You know, the title of the talk given was movement lawyering, and I find that I kind of question, well, am I the person to talk about that? And part of that is because there are so many movements that make up the progressive movements in this country, as well as within the Lawyers Guild. And there are so many different styles and examples of what constitutes movement lawyering. So I'll talk about my own experience, basically, as an example of some of that. But to believe that there's this tremendous rich variety of experience that people have had, as well as that people are developing, because it's not just what's gone on in the past that needs to guide us in what we do now. A little bit about myself. It's like kind of how did I come to politics or the National Lawyers Guild? And I suppose it starts out with, I actually lived in the Bay Area for a year when I was 7 years old, and then moved to Iowa City. And somehow my mother got upset at a businessman who was running for city council. I don't really recall why, but there was something that got under her skin, and she announced that she was going to run for city council after we've lived in Iowa for about a year. And she ran this campaign where she handed out leaflets at bus stops. I think she spent about $38 on her first campaign. Allied herself with neighborhood organizations that the city wanted to tear down a bunch of houses in a floodplain, low-income housing, and the people were organizing to talk about that there was a different approach rather than just tearing down the housing to clear the floodplain. The businessman ran a typical campaign, spent several $1,000s, and he was expected to win. Why not? So you have, and she won the campaign. And but it wasn't just my mother that won the campaign. It was in the context of a particular time in this country, post-Watergate, 1974, where the idea of political dialogue and the openness of what potential was and what people thought was possible was greatly expanded over particularly what we see today. And so she was a person who, with her personal motivation and her personal qualities, was able to achieve something, but because of the social context that existed and because of the larger struggle that was going on in society. That's a long way of saying that my babysitting was basically going to city council meetings for about 7 years when she ran on the city council. She ultimately did not get reelected because she went to picket a nightclub that was discriminating against African Americans who wanted asking for ID only from blacks and not letting them in. And for whatever liberal Iowa City thought, and we were a liberal college town, they didn't want their elected officials actually going and picketing and doing public demonstrations outside of bars. That's both personal, and it's also, by the time of '79 when she ran for re-election, the political climate in this country was changing. Ronald Reagan and the counter-revolution got elected and started in 1980. I graduated high school in 1983, so I'm hopefully don't look as old as I am, or some combination thereof. But grew up during a time when the counter-revolution in this country was really in ascendancy, when the people that I went to college with and ultimately to law school with, the best and the brightest, were profound conservatives, reactionary right-wing fascists, quite frankly, and were the people that I struggled against with in college are now all the leadership of the Republican Party in Iowa, the leadership of a lot of the anti-immigrant work going on in Congress. Some of them are actually, House of Representatives right now. I ended up going to school a couple years in California, came back to Iowa, where I got involved in student politics, multi-issue progressive student network. Some of my mentors are people whose homes were raided on September 24th of 2010 in Chicago, whose homes were raided by the FBI, primarily because of their work, their Palestine solidarity work that they have done for 15 or 20 years now. And so that, to fast forward to the present brings me up to one of the reasons I'm here this weekend, which is to take part in this conference tomorrow. It's a very personal thing to me because these are people who gave me my politics. And politics are transmitted to you by people. They're also come about by your own work and your own thought but they do come about because of people you meet and who take the time to mentor you and to organize and to share ideas with you. And for myself, it was very important to my own development that these are people who themselves gained their politics from the new left and the struggles in this country around the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the gay and lesbian movement, the women's movement, the Iranian Revolution. Frankly, one of my people really, 79 and the overthrow of the Shah, and meeting Iranian students on the University of Iowa campus was the most profound political event that transformed this Iowa farm boy into someone who then mentored me and then who went on to get his house raided in September of last year in Chicago, after living in Chicago for years, working for the Harold Washington campaign and doing, multiracial anti-police brutality work, being a union member. So it is this strain that goes back. But for me, what I gathered and was passed to me and has been very important to me is, and it's something that I think it's hard to pick up nowadays from political work and progressive work, is a commitment to anti-imperialism and believing that it's not just imperialism through military occupation, but through the financial system and the domination of monopoly capital in the world and the control of the economic system. And I think that's something that we need to continue to talk about within the Lawyers Guild, within the broader progressive movement. It's not just about building, human rights or about respect for human rights. That the government, our government, can talk about respect for human rights, even as it is the greatest violator of human rights. It can talk about trying to build an anti-terrorist coalition, even as in my mind it is the greatest perpetrator of violence in the world at the current time and in the past few decades. It's a commitment to understanding the centrality in this country of a politics of anti-racism and the right to autonomy and liberation of oppressed nationality groups, of African Americans, of the Chicano Nation, and of other groups to define their own future, and for whites to understand what white privilege means, the way in which I am allowed to go through my life every day, as well as to the struggle that people have and the right to define their own autonomy, to lead their own struggles, and that what we need to understand in terms of what it takes to build a real progressive movement to accept leadership from oppressed nationality groupings. So those are things that are passed on to me, that inform me in terms of what I mean to be a movement lawyer, and are lessons that I'm very happy to have gotten during the age of Ronald Reagan. So maybe it was helpful in some ways because it was easier to be radicalized in a period where what you were opposing was a pretty radical right-wing trend. But those are things that I'd hope we would, continue to develop today. Other than that, a lot of my work is not necessarily movement lawyering as movement work. I practiced criminal defense law for 12 years in Iowa. A lot of what I did was, it was everyday law practice, but with the freedom and the ability from being in practice for myself to engage in other political struggles. Some of that would just be opposing building a new jail in Johnson County in Iowa City, because we knew if you built a new jail, the judges would fill it. Whereas if you had a small, overcrowded jail, they would tend to let people out on bond and bail, pretrial release. Some of that was getting involved in the National Lawyers Guild on an organizational level that eventually ended up in my being a national president of the Lawyers Guild in the 2000 to 2003, was it? Sometime in that time span, hard to remember. I moved to Minneapolis, and that exposure to a bigger urban environment with greater social movements and more social struggle is what allowed me to really do more legal work that was explicitly progressive or explicitly movement type work. A lot of that's been in the rights movement. Frankly, I owe a lot of that to my wife, who is a woman born in Mexico, who is deeply rooted in her community and has an entire different understanding of what immigration struggle means and what it means to represent people who are themselves organizing themselves, and I do as a relatively privileged person approaching it from outside. What I bring to the table, what many lawyers can bring to the table, are technical skills. I have a fluency in the language, a fluency in the political language, a fluency in the law, and from the education that I've been the beneficiary of. And those are skills that I can put into service of other people. but recognizing that a lot of the political direction has to come from the people who themselves are engaged in the struggles and defining what those struggles are. So with that, I think I might want to just kind of jump forward a little bit more into the raids, because that is one of the central things that I'm involved in right now. People might be familiar with the basics of it. Back in September, while many of us were at the National Lawyers Guild Convention in New Orleans, I got a text message that these raids were happening. These were people who had been part of the anti-war movement in the Twin Cities for the past decade. They had organized the largest anti-war protest at the 2008 Republican National Convention. The raids were carried out in Minneapolis and Chicago. They targeted people who were active in the labor movement, who were active in an anti-police brutality movement, people who every day are engaged in organizing and struggle. Many of them also belong to a socialist organization, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which is, you can follow it back as it comes out of the new left of the 1960s and 1970s. The raids, as far as we knew, were carried out based on an investigation that they were engaged in material support of terrorism. And again, this is where the collective knowledge and organization of the Guild, to me, becomes so relevant and so important. Because back when this was basically a law passed in 1996 under a Democratic administration of President Bill Clinton, it was part of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. It was a law that targeted immigrants. It was a law that targeted prisoners across the board. And at the time, the Guild pointed out it was part of a law that could be used to target political activists who were engaged in international solidarity work. My idea, and actually in 1996, was that the Lawyers Guild should give $1 to every one of these designated terrorist organizations, and kind of say to the government, fuck you, we believe we have a right to support these groups that are engaged in national liberation struggles. So that's really what we were talking about at the time. We were talking about groups in the Middle East, we were talking about groups in Colombia, groups in Sri Lanka, that regardless of what you thought of their politics, that within the context of their own countries, were engaged in national liberation struggles, civil wars, and civil conflicts in their own countries. And I view that this material support law that originated under a Democratic president was really designed to keep us from relating to those groups and to keep people from having a support structure that would support and debate and understand what national liberation movements were all about, what people who were fighting U.S. imperialism in their own countries, why they were fighting it. Doesn't mean you had to endorse the tactics that groups use. It doesn't mean you had to pick one group in one country versus another group. But it was a law that was designed to separate people in this country from their ability to engage in a real discussion of the effects of U.S. foreign policy in other countries. And the Guild was part of that. From 1996 on, we recognized at the time we talked about it. We didn't see these laws, however, being used against solidarity activists. After 2001, we did see them. They were used against Muslim Americans and Palestinian Americans. They were primarily used against Islamic charities that were giving money to groups that everyone agreed was doing charitable work, but in places that where you weren't allowed to do that. If it was Gaza Strip, the Holy Land Foundation, which was the largest Islamic charity, was giving money to support charitable groups in Gaza Strip. And they were ultimately prosecuted, under this law for they were actually supporting Hamas. What is remarkable, and what, as lawyers, again, who presented at Guild conventions as these trials were going on and kept us informed of it, they were actually a hung jury the first time they were tried in Dallas. And when you understand what it means to be Muslim American, to be Palestinian, to be tried in Dallas on terrorism charges, and to have a hung jury, that is an extraordinary legal and political victory. If that's not reasonable doubt, I don't know what is. Well, the government came back again, and with a different jury, and bringing in Israeli agents testifying behind black claws, we managed to convict people and send people away for 65 years for donating money to charitable organizations in the occupied territories. But we hadn't seen these laws used against what white activists, mainstream activists, people engaged in international solidarity work.